Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Susan Szymborski-Welsh. I'm the Woodland Carbon Code's Communications Coordinator. On behalf of the Peatland Code team and the Woodland Carbon Code team, I'd like to welcome you all for joining us today. Our presenter is Joe Anderson with the Peatland Code, Mark Reid and Lorna Cole from SRDC, and John Watts from Soil Association Certification will provide an overview of our biodiversity crediting project. They'll touch on the crediting frameworks themselves, the topic of stacking and bundling, monitoring techniques, and the challenge of creating data that can be standardized and independently verified. After the presentations, we'll open out for questions, so please do pop them in the chat as we go, and we'll get to them at the end. I'd also like to highlight that we will be recording today's session so that we can make it available after the event on our websites. I think that's all for me for just now, so I will just hand straight over to Joe.
Thank you so much, Susan. There we go. All right, thanks everyone. So as Susan mentioned, we're going to be talking about the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code Biodiversity Crediting Project. I'll be giving an overview of the project as well as the outcomes and next steps for new credit development. This project was funded by the Ferns program with support from National Heritage Lottery Fund. So as a little bit of background, the aim of this Ferns project was to better understand how biodiversity credits can integrate with the existing carbon credit structure of the codes and keep the codes on par with a rapidly evolving natural capital landscape. There's a lot going on in natural capital, and we want to make sure that our codes have the capacity to keep up with those changes. Some of the key topics that we want to explore is stacking versus bundling. How do we integrate with the existing biodiversity calculation frameworks? We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to make sure that we didn't overcomplicate an already quite complex and young market. But also we wanted to make sure that we maintain the high integrity reputation of the standard. Avoiding reputational risk was one of the key components of this project. So the project was designed in 5 phases. I'll go through those phases in a moment. But the plan was to have a proposed set of standards documents delivered to the executive boards of both codes for review, with the aim to integrate multiple pathways for nature finance into Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code frameworks. As a little background on nature markets, biodiversity credits will always have multiple indicators. They'll be a multi-metric. They're more complex than carbon. So it's difficult to just find a single metric that can fully capture biodiversity. This table to the right shows different types of biodiversity indicators for different aspects of biodiversity. To the left, they're a little bit more simplified, whereas to the right, they get progressively more robust or complex. And then below that, you can see policy sectors. Ecosystems, markets, and biodiversity credits tend towards the more robust and detailed biodiversity data. Right now, there's a strong interest in biodiversity crediting across all sectors, but the greenwashing claims that affected the carbon market in the past few years have been a serious concern. So we want to make sure we get we learn from the challenges of the carbon market when we translate to the biodiversity crediting market. This often comes up as well. I want to clarify the difference between biodiversity net gain and voluntary biodiversity credits. So biodiversity net gain is part of a compliance market, which has the scaffolding of UK planning policy around it. However, the voluntary biodiversity credits, or VBCs, need to be able to stand alone independent of that regulatory body that BNG has. So most voluntary biodiversity credits have a much higher standard of data than just BNG on its own. That could change, but that's just the landscape right now. It's also a compliance versus a voluntary market, which attracts really different audiences. Biodiversity credits, as I've said, the market is still quite nascent. Guidance has begun to be developed on an international scale for what is needed for these different types and the different safeguards that would be required for voluntary biodiversity credits, but it's not very It's still quite young and it's not super well established. The diagram to the right shows just a few examples of different types of calculation methodologies. As you can see, you can take the same units and split them up in tons of different ways to try and calculate your uplift. Because of this, there's a huge spectrum of prices and quality of biodiversity credits. The Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code, being high integrity credits, will always ensure that they are on the high integrity side of that spectrum. Just this month, after continued conversations post COP16, $200 billion globally has been mobilized for biodiversity restoration and uplift. But how it's going to be spent is still up for debate. Biodiversity credits offer a pathway for that, but there's challenges with issues of offsetting responsibility and best use of funds. So that money has the potential to really accelerate the biodiversity crediting market. But again, we have to make sure we do it right from the get-go as much as we can. So the project approach, as I said, there were 5 phases. Phase 1 was market research. This was at the end of 2023. We did a systemic review of existing biodiversity quantification frameworks. We reviewed over a dozen and then several certification programs as well. Across the board, there were 3 main challenges with some of the existing systems we came across. The first was that the framework was below the market average in terms of data quality and quantity. As I said, we will always err on the side of high integrity, and there was a risk of greenwashing accusations down the road if we aligned with a framework that was not as robust as what appeared to be the market trajectory. The second one was where frameworks tried to completely reinvent the market. There was a lot of, because it's a novel space, there were a lot of players who wanted to sort of completely deviate from the structure of the carbon market. Things like additionality, permanence, and other challenges with our incompatibilities between biodiversity crediting and carbon crediting were highlighted. The codes are part of an established carbon market, and we want to maintain our integrity within established high integrity carbon markets. So any framework that really deviated from those existing frameworks would probably not work well with ours. And the final problem was that the framework was already owned or run by a competing carbon standard. So Vera has a biodiversity crediting framework, Plan Vivo does, but there's not really a framework or incentive for a program to engage with the Woodland Carbon Code or Peatland Code for their carbon projects and just tack on the biodiversity crediting from a different carbon framework. There just wasn't a pipeline for that type of work to be done. So as we moved into phase 2, which was developing an approach for piloting, we selected the Operation Wallacea methodology for biodiversity credit calculation. This table on the right shows a comparison of a range of ways to quantify biodiversity. And as you can see, the Wallacea Trust methodology most fully covers the largest range of aspects of biodiversity. It's established both globally and domestically in a nascent market, so there's projects internationally. It's an open source framework upon which a biodiversity standard can be built. So it allows for the contextualization required for a niche standard such as the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code. Other large market competitors have adapted this system for their own. For example, Plan Vivo's biodiversity crediting is an adapted Operation Wallacea method. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're aligning as much as we can with an existing framework that has somewhat broad acceptance across this new market. And 1 credit is a 1% uplift of biodiversity across 1 hectare. We had the capacity to contextualize this method to the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code. So we worked with biodiversity experts connected to the codes and SRUC to initially create a theoretical framework for piloting by identifying the key metrics that we thought could capture changes in biodiversity in UK woodlands and peatlands. So phase 3 was piloting. 4 projects were selected to have their biodiversity baseline measured. This included 5 metrics per the OPWAL guidance. We collaborated with Replanet to provide monitoring services for 4 of those metrics. We also worked with Soil Association certification to pilot biodiversity data validation. So we wanted to understand what independent validation would look like in the biodiversity crediting market what lessons we could take from the carbon market and what we would need to change. The table here is just an example of the results of 4 bioacoustic monitors for bird diversity across one of our sites. We learned a ton through this piloting process. One is that site staffing and conditions affect monitoring more so than it may with carbon calculations and validation. For example, wild or domesticated animals prevented some sites from being visited. Weather was also a challenge in collecting some of this on-site biodiversity data. The carbon validation process, though it provided a nice scaffolding for what independent validation could look like, also needed several changes for biodiversity. This will be discussed later in this presentation. And how do we make sure that while we can monitor these 5 metrics that we feel are really strong at capturing biodiversity, what are the different monitoring techniques that are robust enough to be used in this context? Because if we're too explicit about you have to do it exactly this way, it won't contextualize well to real world environments. Phase 4 was reviewing the piloting process and developing documentation. So we had a second round of review of the metrics after piloting. We sent surveys to project developers and scientists, followed by roundtable discussions. We worked with the SRUC team as well as the UK Land Carbon Registry to review stacking and bundling structure and find where we could integrate with those structures. And we developed a suite of documents to provide the scaffolding for a future biodiversity standard. Within that suite of documents was standards documents for the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code, a proposed project design document. If you have ever tried to do a project with the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code, you're familiar with what is included in a project design document, and a guidance document. Because this is such a new market, this document helps folks navigate the other two by adding additional background information and context. So we're currently in phase 5, which is education and outreach. The suite of documents was presented to the advisory and executive boards, after which a public consultation was completed, and the outcomes of the public consultation were integrated into the suite of documents as much as possible. A summary report from the public consultation was created, and this was all then represented to the executive boards. We're also creating a learning package where the outcomes, lessons, and resources from this project are collated into a toolbox to support anyone else who's supporting the development of UK natural capital markets. This presentation will be part of that, and all the material for the learning toolkit will be available online shortly. So credit structure is a topic that is on everyone's mind in this market. This diagram comes from Julia McCarthy in an article titled Beetles in a Haystack. And it kind of shows from the most bundled bundle on the left to the most stacked stack on the right, if that makes sense. Sort of the two extremes of some of the approaches we're looking at. So the current Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code carbon credits are actually an implicit bundle. You're buying a carbon credit, but implied with that carbon uplift is social benefits, biodiversity benefits, water benefits, because it's a nature restoration project. So those aren't explicitly quantified, but they're implied with the purchase. If you move all the way to the right side of this, a true stack, this is mostly a theoretical market. I believe that there's some examples of true stacked credits in Australia right now, but not necessarily within the framework of a very well-regulated market with lots of safeguards. The challenges come with both buyer and seller claims and additionality because you're separating the action from the outcome. So if you plant a tree, one buyer buys a carbon credit, one buyer buys a biodiversity credit. It's completely independent from each other. What can each of those buyers actually claim? Because the carbon buyer didn't exclusively fund the tree planting. It was both of them together. So the claims get really challenging. As we move from a true stack, moving to the left of the screen into a linked stack, this, as I understand, mostly exists in US markets for regulated nature offsetting. So if we're looking at streams and wetlands and that sort of thing, where the credits can be sold independently, but the price of the credit is linked to the sales of the other ones. This creates really volatile pricing, which is quite challenging in an already nascent market. So for this project, the standards looked at either an explicit bundle or a multi-credit bundle. We initially were looking at a multi-credit bundle, and then we started working with the UK Land Carbon Registry. They were at the New York Climate Week at the end of 2024, and there was a lot of discussion around how we combine these different credits. But right now, there was no market consensus on how you combine different credit types into a multi-credit bundle. So there's different rates of credit generation between carbon and biodiversity, and carbon is a predicted credit, whereas biodiversity is from measured outcomes. So if you were to try and create a multi-credit bundle where you sell multiple credits that are intrinsically tied to each other, so they have to be sold as a bundle, but it is unique credits. Do you have a set ratio that you sell them in? Is it per vintage or per hectare? How do you deal with fractional credits? Because you might end up with 1.25 biodiversity credits per one carbon credit. And generally, fractional credits are not seen as indicative of a well-regulated and high-integrity market. So if a standard chooses the wrong framework for combining credits in a multi-credit bundle, and then the market moves towards a different one, it represents a long-term reputational risk for the standard, the project developers, and the credits themselves, because the bundling framework really informs a lot of the safeguarding and the types of claims that buyers and sellers can make. So for the takeaway of this is right now, the standards can only safely support an explicit bundle. This is one step more complex than the implicit bundle where we are right now, where someone would buy a sort of flagship credit, which would probably be carbon since the market's better established. But with each carbon credit, they would be able to make a claim on a quantified biodiversity uplift associated with that carbon per hectare. So for example, for each carbon credit, you could say it also funded a 2.5% biodiversity uplift across a hectare. Claims like that, the issues with fractional credits aren't as challenging, and it's an explicit bundle rather than a multi-credit bundle, which protects the reputation a little bit more. The nice thing is the infrastructure for an explicit bundle and a multi-credit bundle are quite similar. So we can create the scaffolding for one, and as the market dictates what good practice is, we can transition from one to the other. The other piece that came from this investigation of credit types is the issue of shallow peats. For anyone who's tried to do projects with the peatland code, there is just the unfortunate reality that shallow peat typically does not meet the standards for carbon crediting. However, the Operation Wallacea framework that we have developed within those standards documents could be applied to shallow peat to develop standalone biodiversity credits. So sort of implicit bundle, but where the main credit is a biodiversity credit. This would allow for a wider mosaic of landscapes to be covered across the UK, where areas of deep peat could do standalone carbon or an explicit bundle of carbon and biodiversity, and the shallow peat can still access natural capital through biodiversity credits using the same methodologies. So the outcomes of this project were both the Woodland Carbon Code and executive boards and the Peatland Code executive boards acknowledged the importance of expanding the codes to keep up with natural capital markets, particularly through the development of biodiversity credits. But the boards determined that prior to formally adopting any framework for biodiversity crediting, additional funding should be secured for additional piloting, addressing knowledge gaps, and continued development for the framework. Basically, they determined that 15 months is not enough time for small niche standards to develop a new natural capital framework in an already quite young and volatile market. But that we should still continue to work towards that as the market evolves. The result of the public consultation and feedback from the advisory boards have also been used to identify what key next steps in the development of biodiversity credits should be explored. So the next steps are pursuing additional funding and identifying key partnerships to address the existing gaps. One of the main gaps is more comprehensive data sets. So what does good look like? our piloting only monitored biodiversity for the baseline of pre-restoration or pre-woodland creation sites. So we don't necessarily know what good looks like after restoration using these same metrics. Once we know what good looks like by collecting more comprehensive data sets across a range of woodlands and peatlands that are at different stages of restoration, we could create a community similarity index or a mean species abundance framework. What these would allow us to understand is if a site's just increasing biodiversity, that doesn't necessarily mean it's creating a really quality woodland or peatland habitat, whereas a community similarity index in the MSA could contextualize the biodiversity uplift in comparison to those quality habitats. This data on mature sites would also be very helpful for financial modeling. Without this data, uplift is purely speculative. We can't necessarily predict the potential biodiversity credit creation of a site without data on mature sites. Again, because this market is continually growing, we want to make sure that we continue to align with the emerging market. BSI 702, for example, came out about 2/3 of the way through this project. So even the initial domestic guidance on this market wasn't even there when we started this project. This is true with a lot of different regulatory bodies, both international and domestic, and different UK government initiatives. So we want to make sure that we have the capacity to evolve this program in correspondence to those external features. Finally, we want to identify gaps in existing market infrastructure. So we want to know, once we have formally adopted a program, what are the bottlenecks for project developers in terms of cost and efficiency, and how do we make sure that we support the development of those aspects of these sort of peripheral market players. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to everyone who supported with this project. I really appreciate everyone's feedback. And now I will hand it over to my esteemed colleagues at SRUC.
Thanks very much, Joe. So I'm going to lead off, but I'll hand over to Dr. Lorna Cole, Senior Ecologist with us at SAC Consulting, who has worked very closely with Dr. Nick Littlewood as the specialist ecologists on the team. For those of you who know me, I'm more on the market side, so coordinating only, and so giving you a bit of context for today's presentation. Lorna, if you want to move to the next slide. Essentially what we're trying to do with this is to make more projects financially viable, to bring new areas in, to expand the impact of these codes. And at the same time, give project developers the opportunity to be able to shout about the benefits that their projects deliver for nature. But what we need to do is to balance the need for standardization with flexibility. So we want metrics that are standardized, but that can also adapt to the specificities of sites where need be. Metrics which are accurate enough to be credible. And I would argue that when you compare what we have done, adapting this to the specificities of UK peatlands and woodlands, it gives us scope to do something far more accurate and credible than you can ever achieve with a global standard that is designed to work across all habitats internationally. But of course, for the context of the market, you need something that is easy enough and cost effective enough for projects to be able to collect the data. And so to support that, we have developed a learning package with guidance that can support projects in collecting all the necessary data to verify their biodiversity claims. Lorna, over to you.
So the learning package, we focused on 5 key taxa: plants, ground active invertebrates, insect pollinators, bats and birds. Now, as Joe mentioned, biodiversity is never easy, it's highly complex, and we therefore need a basket of metrics. We need to measure a range of different biodiversity things to actually determine how successful a project is. Now, these metrics should include structural metrics, so information on the habitats present, their condition, alongside taxonomic metrics. Now, as Mark says, it's highly complex. Luckily for us, the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code have two things in our favour that makes it slightly more similar. Is firstly, they're all UK-based projects, and secondly, we're talking about a limited number of habitats and restoration actions. However, we do still need to look at multiple taxa, and that, of course, means multiple sampling techniques. It's more complex than that, of course, because each taxa may have 2 or 3 different sampling techniques. So one of our first things was to try and determine which method is the most appropriate, and that will depend on the focal species, the available resources, and the ease of external validation and verification. So we first compared methodologies. We looked at a range of different criteria, for example, equipment costs, labour costs, the level of expertise needed, and how a measure aligns itself to independent validation and verification. So a quick overview for 2 different methodologies: pollinator transect walks versus pan traps. Obviously, equipment for a transect walk is simply a butterfly net, so it's relatively cheap. However, it requires a high level of expertise in the field and also is quite costly, so labour in the field is also high. Because when you're conducting a transect walk, you're typically monitoring your invertebrates on the hoof, you're not collecting a large number of samples, it makes it more difficult to validate. You don't have a physical collection that someone can then look at and verify that your identification is correct. Pan traps, on the other hand, you do have this physical sample that people can check. You could get experts to ID, you could use DNA methods to ID it. But at the same time, this requires a high level of input in the lab, although they're cheap to run in the field. So basically, no method is ideal, and we often found a trade-off that methods that allow for independent validation and verification are often more costly or they need expert input. So overall, no survey method is perfect, and as Mark and Joe have both said, we need to develop a high integrity market. We need to gain investors' trust. So on one hand, we need robust metrics. We need methods that will reliably sample the expected change in community. We need it to be reproducible. So if I went out one day and Mark went out the next, we'd get very similar results. And finally, we need it to be verifiable as well. Now, on the other hand, we need to make sure that the methods are viable to implement in the field. So we need to ensure they're economically costly, and monitoring biodiversity can be costly. We need to ensure that the project team have sufficient time and that there's sufficient expertise as well. So it's very much a balancing act, trying to ensure we've got this high integrity market that is not going to cripple us with additional project costs. So as mentioned before, we focus primarily on 5 taxa. Some taxa had multiple methods that we considered could be appropriate. So for insect pollinators, we explored transect walks and pan traps. Ground active invertebrates, very much pitfall traps were the front runner. There was little to compete with them. Birds, we considered both acoustic recorders and point counts. Bats, our focus was on acoustic recorders, and for plants, we had plant quadrats. So for each of these 7 survey techniques, we produced a guidance document. So that document started off with an overview of the method. So what taxa the method sampled, how easy it was to use, what level of expertise was needed, how easy equipment was to source, and also links to wider use. So are these methods used in monitoring schemes across the UK or Europe, how they might be used in research. The methodology provided a list of equipment and also the process section. This first started with a pre-site visit, so the predetermined sampling points may not be appropriate, so we felt it was necessary to visit the site to look to see if any sampling points were really dangerous to access, or some methodologies had their own unique problems. So for example, you wouldn't want to place insect pan traps in heavily shaded environments. So the process also considered how many samples you might want to take, how these samples are placed, timings, what is the ideal time of year to survey, and any sort of constraints. So for example, you wouldn't want to do an insect transect walk when it's not sunny and warm. Then finally, the process provided a step-by-step guidance on what you do in the field. The next section looks at the metrics generated, and as Jo said, different taxa may respond differently to change. So for example, if we were to create a woodland from a grassland field, we may not necessarily expect the number of ground beetle species to increase. So for that, we're looking more at a change in the community structure. So we'd expect some of the bigger, chunkier Carabus species to start coming in. So some metrics such as indicator species might be appropriate, whereas in others it might be a change in community structure. Next, we provided some ways we can take that methodology and elevate it to increase the validation and verification. So that could be taking a georeferenced photograph of a plant quadrat. It could be ensuring that DNA extraction is undergone by a reputable laboratory. This type of validation and verification that can just lift the integrity of the methodology up a bit. Of course, all survey techniques have their limitations. So for example, if you're using acoustic monitoring, then it's going to underrepresent quieter bird species. We provided a list of alternative methods, and finally a link to different resources. As we were designing these methodologies, we thought we need to actually provide guidance in the bigger picture. So how do you actually apply them at the site level? Now, again, this is quite complex. So on one hand, we need robust monitoring. We need that monitoring to adhere to what is required in the standards and codes. We need adequate samples to be taken. We need that monitoring to be long-term, and we need means of verification and validation. Now, that all pushes towards a very standardized approach. However, each site is unique. So we need to account for that uniqueness. We need to look at the habitats that are going to be restored, their condition, and what actions are going to be undertaken. We need to ensure that the taxa that are chosen are appropriate for the site, and we also need to consider the resources that the project team at the site might have. So we produced 8 key steps to try and guide people through determining where to sample, how many samples to take. So first is to start with a basic habitat map. What have you on your site and what actions are going to be undertaken? From that, determine the percentage of the site for each habitat type and restoration action. And this allows us to produce a stratified sampling approach, which we feel is probably the most robust approach. So, for example, if you have a blanket bog and 75% of that bog has to be reprofiled and re-wetted, with the remaining 25% just to be re-wetted, the number of sampling points in each of these 2 conditions should equate to the percentage of that habitat. Then how do we actually decide where these sampling points go? We felt that to avoid any sort of like bias, we should put them in a randomized, we should select these randomly. So that would create a randomized stratified sampling plan. Then you need to consider your long term, when are you going to monitor, how frequently you're going to monitor, and for how long. As Joe mentioned, sometimes we don't know what good looks like. So what is that required endpoint? Do we have data that we can use, or do we need to survey a reference site? So that reference site could be a pristine blanket bog in close proximity, or a blanket bog that successfully underwent restoration. Before we actually draw a line out under everything, we need to do a pre-site visit to finalise the sampling location, so we're not changing things halfway through that could be dodgy, let's just say. And finally, ensure that the scheme complies with the codes and standards. So overall, because sites are unique and we can't we can't dictate that you need X, Y, and Z samples in X, Y, and Z habitats, the way forward is most likely to look at independent experts approving the monitoring plan and guiding that monitoring plan. So I will stop sharing, and I think, John, you're up next.
Great, many thanks, Lorna. That's great. Hopefully you can all see my screen okay. So I'm John. I'm from the Climate and Landscape team at Soil Association Certification, and I'm going to be speaking to you about some of the validation outputs from the pilot sites. Firstly, who we are at Soil Association Certification. So we are a ISO accredited UK leading certification body certifying sustainable farming, land use and forestry and their related supply chains and commodities. Within the Climate and Landscape team, our focus is upon providing assurance within the voluntary carbon and ecosystem service markets. And we are an approved validation and verification body for the Woodland Carbon Code, for the Peatland Code, and for the Wilder Carbon Standard for Climate and Nature. We also support the continued development of these codes and also work on supporting the emergence of new codes in this space through general piloting processes, including recently working with the Saltmarsh Carbon Code. I thought I'd start really by briefly unpacking what is meant by validation and verification within the context of a nature-based project. So third-party validation and verification provides expert assurance of high project integrity, including any greenhouse gas assertions or nature-based claims that are made. Validation and verification are related yet distinct processes. So validation occurs in advance of restoration and is an assessment of a project plan against the qualifying criteria. So for instance, the Woodland Carbon Code criteria or the Peatland Code criteria. And that includes an assessment of baseline and projected greenhouse gas or nature-based biodiversity assertions that are made on site. Verification then occurs after the restoration at intervals and is an assessment of whether those project outcomes have been delivered. The requirements and principles for validation and verification bodies are defined in ISO standards, so ISO 14064 and 14065 and ISO 17029, for which we are accredited by UCAS against those standards to deliver our validation and verification services. Third-party validation and verification is recognised in the ICVCM's core carbon principles as a key tenet of their core carbon principles, and BSI also reference the importance of third-party validation and verification as part of their NatureFlex standard. In terms of this project, our objective was to undertake pre-pilot validation assessments, so that's a validation assessment rather than a verification assessment, to support the development of an auditable biodiversity crediting methodology, which is some of which you've heard about already from Joe. The key difference for us here with a usual pilot project is that we're not undertaking a validation against draft criteria, but are instead using the validation process to inform the development of the methodology. And so in the absence of a defined criteria, our focus was really on understanding the best means by which to have confidence in the baseline biodiversity data sets that were provided to us. We've already heard this from Joe, but the methodology makes use of a multi-metric approach to calculate biodiversity baseline and change over time. And this comprises of at least one structural element and 3 or more taxonomic metrics. We're going to discuss some examples of the different data sets we received for each of the metrics. And the example here on screen are the ones that are specific to the pilot sites that we undertook the pilot validations against. So in terms of our approach, the first thing we did was to assemble an audit team, and that included the use of technical experts. So we used my colleague Eamon, who's a chartered ecologist and specialises in upland habitats. He's also an existing Peatland Code validator and a former senior ecologist for the National Trust in Scotland. And Andy Grundy, who some of you may know, he's head of climate and landscape at Soil Association, but he's also a chartered forester. Has a broad portfolio of experience in forestry management and is an existing Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code validator. In terms of limitations, we've already talked about the absence of defined criteria at this point. I think that the nature of a project like this is that you have these concurrent work streams, and at the point we're undertaking the validations, the kind of methodological processes haven't been fully defined. In terms of the data that we looked at, we're limited to looking, as Joe mentioned, at the baseline at this point. So we're not looking as part of the validation to look at the projected uplift. The site visits also occurred the validation site visits also occurred at a different time of year to the baseline surveying, which is an obvious limitation in terms of comparability. The data collection, the surveying approaches, outputs also really differed between the different project sites. This less of a limitation really, because it really enabled us to test what worked and what perhaps didn't work so well. In terms of being on site, our site visit methodology comprised of visiting a sample of exacting locations to assess the accuracy of the baseline metrics and the monitoring methodologies that had been employed. And the technical experts were asked to consider, where possible, that based on the habitat type and condition and the visible vegetation, that the baseline metrics could be fairly represented at the site. So the first one we'll look at is the structural metric, and an example here from Fordy Estate of the kind of data sets that we received. So Fordy Estate is located in Perthshire in Scotland. The site is a mosaic of habitats. So the southern section is made up of a conifer plantation and broadleaf woodland with open areas of scrub and wetland. The north section of the site included acidic grassland, dry and wet heath and blanket bog. And the data sets that we received were outputs from an ecological survey report that included a UK HABS assessment to level 5 and the related outputs. So we had mapping, we had an explanation of the survey methods that were undertaken on site, and then some of the related outputs in terms of the habitat type and condition assessments. So how did we go about assessing this data? Well, it was really a combination of desk-based review and field visit. So in the first instance, we used GIS. So we had satellite imagery that we were able to contrast with the mapping to identify any kind of obvious issues in terms of the mapping and the way that the polygons had been set out there against the different habitat types. And it was also useful to do that to inform sampling approach when we're on site as part of the validation. So one of the criteria within the ISO standards for which we're accredited is that we undertake a risk assessment and a strategic analysis before going on site. And being able to look at data in advance of going out gave us a good sense of perhaps what we could look at when we are on site. The other thing we were able to do is undertake an evaluation of technical competence. And that's specific to the people that are undertaking that baseline survey. And that acts as a really important means of verification in terms of how confident we are in the data sets that we've received. And for this site, we had really good evidence of technical competency for the individuals that had undertaken the survey. In terms of the site visit itself, technical experts were then in the field. As you can see from this image here, there's Eamon and Andy in the field, and we're visiting a set of sample locations in order to make an assessment of how the habitat condition corresponded with the outputs from the survey based on the observations that we're able to make whilst being on site. Despite the high level of technical expertise, there were a few things that we identified when we were on site. So the example that's given here is an error in the mapping. So we were able to see that this section of the satellite imagery corresponding with this polygon here differed to this area here. So the bottom here is an area of dry heath, which in fact should have been mapped as a continuation of the adjacent flush. So this is actually how the habitat looks whilst we were on site. And we think that's simply a polygon error. This polygon here is separate to this one, even though it's the same habitat type. And in fact, it looks as though it should have been a continuation of this polygon instead. So it's just an example of the sort of thing that we might pick up from looking at both the satellite imagery, but also from being out on site. The on-site assessment complemented our desk-based review of the data sets, and that informed an audit report, which included outputs from sampling undertaken at different locations based on the habitat type and conditions that were defined in the data sets that we received. In terms of kind of top-line outputs against structural metric, we feel there is a need for a code-specific field guide, so a continuation of really what Lorna was discussing, and that would support a defined methodological approach to baselining and monitoring that is consistent across project sites, albeit with the need for some of the flexibility that's already been mentioned. And we feel that's key for consistency in approach. We also think that evidence of severe competency is really important as a means of validation, and that should be to a defined threshold that's mandated as part of the code criteria, and that would then need to be evidenced by the project developer as part of the management plan that they would submit for the project. We also feel that there is a need for the submission of in situ photography, which is something that we already use for the peatland code, for instance, to evidence condition on a peatland, and that must be taken to support the definition of the baseline habitat type and condition. And that would be particularly important in the absence of actually being able to undertake a field visit. So depending on how the validation is actually undertaken, if we're not out on site, we really do feel it's important that we've got some additional supporting evidence for any of the kind of claims that are made around the condition. Moving on to the taxonomic metrics. Now, these get increasingly harder to do the validation for. The first of these is higher plants. For Fordy Estate, and I'm going to contrast the two different sites here. So Fordy Estate on the left here, we were given an outline of the fieldwork methodologies for how the assessments were undertaken, which was kind of fairly traditional, really, via Quadrat. That gave us information about the rationale for sampling and their stratification, etc., locations that were chosen for sampling. We had related outputs, so we had the mapping that we had before with the different habitat types, but also the locations, the exacting locations of where the fieldwork was undertaken in terms of plant identification, as well as those outputs specific to species at these various locations. What we are able to then do is whilst we're on site, is to visit those areas, and given already the limitations that I've mentioned about it occurring, the validation visit occurring at a different time of year, So not really providing a fair comparison. We were really assessing whether or not the outputs were reasonable based on our site visit to that specific location. And I guess it's important to emphasize that ecologists don't always exactly agree. And for us, it was important to literally not get too caught up in the weeds and to actually assess those outputs based on how reasonable they are in terms of our observations on site, but also things like typical distributions, etc. For Erikstein, we had a slightly different set of data. We had data that was compiled by the use of the Mosaic Earth app, which I can't really do justice in my explanation of it, but I would invite you to look at search for Mosaic Earth and look at their approach. It was really useful for us because it gave us photographs to look at exacting georeference locations, and that was really useful to evidence the exacting vegetation that was seen at the time that the baseline surveys were undertaken. The methodology for the baselining here required somebody in the field who was a non-expert to follow the prescriptive guidance that was provided by Mosaic Earth. And they would then take the photographs, which would be uploaded and then labelled to species level by an ecologist remotely. And so that's the data set that we received. Again, this was really useful in terms of us being able to see what was on site at the point that the baseline surveys were undertaken. But we feel we'd want to see the technical competency for the ecologists undertaking the species identification, and there'd be a need to look closer at the method around the photography that's taken. The validation team felt like one of the limitations with this is that it doesn't necessarily accommodate an evaluation of ground flora. So it could be that things are lost in the sward, for instance, that you can't see other than being out on site. And our feeling here really is that it would really be useful to have something between the two. So a kind of a traditional survey that's undertaken by somebody whose evidence is competent, supported by photographic evidence of what was seen at the time. In terms of birds, we were in receipt of a modified common bird census survey for Fordy Estate, and that came with the related mapping where the different species were identified and the outputs that we were then able to assess mostly remotely because there was limited things that we could do on site around this one. So we were looking at the distributions and considering whether, again, it was reasonable, some of the data sets that we were receiving based on the survey techniques that were undertaken and the associated outputs. The kind of key thing for us here for this particular validation is that the surveys were undertaken during the summer months, and we felt consideration should be given to overwintering birds, which may not be identified in a summer survey, but that are likely to be affected by any habitat changes attributable to the restoration activity. The other set of data that we had for Erikstein was bioacoustic monitoring. So we had outputs from bioacoustics. Again, it was interesting to see this as a different form of output. We feel there is a need for criteria here to evidence the methodology and its efficacy, particularly if you're using any kind of technology there. Any kind of black boxes are a concern when we're undertaking validation, and so we'd want to really be sure that we could understand how that works and what the efficacy is of the outputs. In terms of competency information, again, we'd want to see some competency information of whoever's undertaking the assessment of those recording outputs. And we did notice in the provisional data sets that we received, there was a species identified that we didn't feel as though would typically match the distribution at that site. So it's the kind of thing that we might, again, challenge a project developer with as part of their baseline survey. The other issue that was identified actually by the project developer themselves in the use of bioacoustics is that one of the recorders was turned on during transit, so it didn't have the same. It couldn't be used and had to be removed from the data sets. Finally, onto inverts. This was, again, for Fordy, it was a more traditional survey that was undertaken using quadrats. Again, we felt it was limited in usefulness in terms of us being in the field to review the approach here, and it was more a case of assessing competency again and looking again at things like distribution and what we'd expect to see at that site and whether the outputs were reasonable. We did see evidence of what we thought might be a pitfall trap, but again, this wasn't. We couldn't be 100% that actually wasn't just a hole in the ground, for instance. And how useful is that in terms of a means of validation? For Eric Stain, we had some meta-barcoding data. Again, we feel there would be a need for evidence of the methodology and its efficacy to be confident with the outputs from this, and there were inconsistencies that were identified by the project developer, which included taxonomic groups that were visually identified but not detected in the meta-barcoding analysis, and orders in the meta-barcoding data for which no individuals belonging to that group were identified. So there were kind of some inconsistencies in the data that we got back from it. In terms of baseline data gathering errors, I just wanted to flag a few things that were specific to the site at Eric Stain. Initially, one of the issues that was identified that came out from the outputs from the project developer was that not all sampling locations were visited as part of every survey. So there were several survey sites. When they were going out to do the surveys, not every survey site was seen in every instance, and then things like averages were being used between different survey points, and we didn't feel that was robust enough from a validation point of view. There was also issues around sampling not occurring at the frequency specified in the defined methods. So at this site, it was due to the several samples taken over an extended period of time, and it ended up being quite a concentrated period of time instead, which would limit the species that were actually monitored as part of that baseline survey. There was also a lack of consistency in the data gathering techniques between the sampling visits. So some of the sample sites, sample visits that occurred used hand collection, and then at the same sampling location you're using a bugback, and again that inconsistency creates an issue from a validation point of view for that data. One of the important things about these errors is that in the large part they were identified by the project developer. So in the data sets that we received, it was clear that these were issues that had occurred. It wouldn't necessarily be obvious if we're looking at the output data only. And so we feel there's a real need for raw data to be submitted as supporting evidence to compare the finalized outputs against the against that raw data set for each species metric. And then finally, just some top line outputs from the taxonomic metrics. We feel again there's that need for a code-specific field guide, so a development of some of the things that Lorna's been discussing, and that the field protocol should state a minimum reporting output and frequency of sampling visits, etc. We'd want to see a bit more standardization, we think, in terms of having confidence around the data and its comparability. Evidence again of severe confidence is key. Again, use of in situ photographs of baselining methods and outputs. And that speaks to the supporting evidence that we'd want to see. So evidence that all survey locations were visited in every instance using the same method, and having, again, those raw data set outputs to support any finalized data outputs that we receive. Again, the use of third parties for monitoring methods. We think the code should include criteria around the efficacy of the method and the competency of the individuals and organizations that are undertaking that work. So if you are using a lab, is it ISO accredited? Does it have the correct accreditation in order for us to have confidence in their assessment of the data outputs? That's me. I think I'll hand over next now. Is it back to you, Susan, I think?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, John. Thanks everyone for your presentations. So we'll now move over into answering any questions that people may have. So just put them into the chat and we'll come to you. We've just had a couple so far. A question from Alan, who's wondering if there is a published report on the work from SAC.
Yeah, so the work is complete and is going to be going on to the website. IUCN team, I'm not sure when do you expect that to be live?
So we're hoping to host this information both on the Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code sites. However, both websites are undergoing updates right now. The anticipated time that all of the documentation along with this recording will be on the website is by the end of the month. I can't provide you with an exact URL just yet because of the website updates, but keep your eyes on both the codes websites before the end of the month.
Great, thank you. And then we just had a question from Neil, sorry, not from Neil, from Gulmira, asking about the app that you were talking about. John, I think it was Mosaic Earth, is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I think someone's put a link and put it into the chat, a response there. Yeah.
That's right. And can people just find that in app stores, or is it a web-based system?
It's both. So yeah, Neil's here. Yeah, Neil's your man. He's given you the link in there where you can find out more information. Again, I couldn't really do it justice. It's really clever what they've put together. So yeah, do go and have a look.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a question from Ed here. Can biodiversity credits be applied to existing woodland or recently created new woodland, or does it have to be applied before new woodland is created, like the Woodland Carbon Code?
Yeah, we get this question a lot. The point of this isn't to discredit the work that has already occurred under existing Woodland Carbon Code projects in terms of biodiversity. However, this question comes back to the issue of financial additionality, which is a tenet of integrity in carbon standards. So what that basically means is the project has to have demonstrated that the project would not be feasible without the additional income from the carbon credits. Like if that woodland creation would have happened because of other market mechanisms, it's not truly additional, and therefore a credit would almost be redundant. And we're running into the same issue with projects that already exist without biodiversity credits. So by trying to plug in biodiversity credits to an existing project, they wouldn't be financially additional because the project already has evidence that carbon credits alone can fund the project. While there's still not 100% consensus on where financial additionality will fall in biodiversity crediting, it would threaten the ICVCM standard requires financial additionality, which is how integrity in the voluntary carbon market is currently defined. So by not requiring financial additionality for new biodiversity crediting projects, it could threaten the integrity of the carbon side of the standards. So it is unfortunate that projects that are already underway would not, I can't see a way where they would meet the financial additionality requirements as set out by the carbon market. So these should only be used to create additional funding for work that wouldn't happen otherwise.
Great, thank you. A question from Ruth. The field validation work reminded her of the work that is undertaken for the UK CEH Countryside Survey. This has been developed over many iterations, and she's wondering if we had explored the learning from this long-running process.
So Laura, do you want to get that? There's also a question from Elaine around the material that we've developed and how specific it is to woodlands versus peatlands versus the both habitats.
So with respect to the countryside survey, we've really focused mainly on the taxonomics metrics, so more detailed biodiversity surveys. What we've tried to do is look at existing schemes like the pollinator monitoring scheme and the environmental change network to try and align where possible with aspects such as what's the ideal timing, how far apart should samples go. The kind of taxa that you consider in woodland versus peatland are slightly different. I think that's Ed's question, is it?
That's
so
it.
Effectively, I can't see the question.
So John made a recommendation for code-specific field guidance, and just in terms of the guidance that we provided in the learning package, and the extent to which that applies to both peatlands and woodlands. Yeah, Lorna.
Yeah, so obviously the taxa, there's guidance on which taxa you should consider for woodlands versus peatlands, and so it's a matter of kind of using the full package alongside what is recommended in the standards that Joe's worked on. So effectively, if you're recommended to survey ground active invertebrates and plants, then you'll go to the learning package to see the best ways to survey these.
Yeah, I'd agree with Lorna there that it's kind of a combination of the project design documents, which are outlined in the suite of documents for the standard, which would give you sort of how you would register a project, how you would set up a project, and what it would take to get a project independently verified by an expert, with the specific implementation guidance for the different methods that Lorna and the SRUC learning package focused on. There, in terms of having a code-specific field guide that would tell someone exactly how to go out there, I don't think we're there yet. But between the project design document and the specific guidance for the metrics, it's moving towards that. One of the components that future research we want to look at would include how much of the independent expert review of the monitoring plan would be sufficient versus how prescriptive we can be with those two components between the project design documents and the metric specific guidance. There's kind of this balancing act between that specificity of those two documents and the assurance that's provided by an independent expert reviewing the monitoring plan as part of project registration.
Perfect, thank you. Nat, I think you've had a couple of questions coming to you as well. Would you like to read them out, please?
Sure, yeah. So one of those was around further information on how project developers could potentially get involved in future piloting. Was there any way that people could reach out to this if there's the plan of doing future work?
Yeah, so for the next phase of the project, it's looking like the peatland code will be the host organization for this future work. So I would highly recommend reaching out to the peatland code. If you go to their website, there's all the contact information there. One of the challenges with standard development, and particularly with some of the framework of Ferns funding, is that we can't give, when trying to develop like a broad tool as an NGO, we have to be careful about giving market preference to particular market players. So the specific conditions upon which different project developers could be involved in either funding their own piloting or supporting the development of this code is it is like a really fine line to walk. Like, we absolutely do want external collaborators, and we need to make sure that we don't accidentally create market preference while building a market framework. But the best way, if that's something that you're interested in, is to reach out to the peatland code directly, and they'd be able to tell you which of the next steps there's potential for collaboration.
Great, thank you. There's just a couple more questions in the chat. So Ed has asked, when can we expect to see biodiversity credits available on the ground?
So the next, one of the key deliverables, it was not in the presentation, but it is one of the next steps internally for the peatland code, is to return to the executive boards and collaborate with them to develop a project roadmap to what they would need to onboard this, because the executive boards were not specific about the threshold of confidence or additional piloting or data aggregation that would be required for them to sign off on it. So that would be one of our next steps, is to really talk to the executive board to almost get a roadmap or a checklist of what they need for confidence in delivering the standard. So I can't actually give you a time on that, but that is probably the next conversation that the development teams would be having with the executive boards, is figuring out how to get from A to B from where we're at right now.
Thank you. And then this next one is probably for you, John. So Kara's asked, from the auditor's perspective, when it comes to the validation/verification process for the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, is the expectation that biodiversity site visits be conducted separately by a qualified ecologist rather than the site visits that are already required and conducted by project developers under the codes?
That's a great question. Thanks, Cara. From our perspective here, I think it's important to see how we can make it synchronized best with the current Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code validation process. As you may or may not be aware, if you are currently going through projects via the Woodland Carbon Code or the Peatland Code, they don't necessitate a validation site visit at the moment. And so I think what we'd need to look at is how could we do the biodiversity assessment in the same way? And if there is a need for a site visit, how can we best accommodate that? The other aspect to this is that a lot of our validation and verification team leaders are qualified to undertake the biodiversity aspect of this validation site visit. So I think it would be something that we could look at doing together based on the scope of the individual auditor. What I would say is that the biodiversity crediting aspect of this is quite significant in terms of time spent by the validator, and therefore it would be in addition to the validation that's undertaken for the carbon aspect.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then Elaine just had another question about publication. So will the project's draft standards for biodiversity crediting be published for reference even while further development work is progressed? Oh, sorry, Joe, I think you're just on mute.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. All of the documents that were presented to the executive and advisory boards and put out for public consultation, the updated and edited versions of those will be part of the learning package. Even though to sort of help with the overall development of the market and to understand the direction and approaches that we took in this project, even as we continue iterative design on what they might look like. And the assumption is, as we work with the executive boards and pursue further funding, we'll be able to continue iterations of these codes and have updated documents as the project updates.
Okay, great. Thanks. And so Amanda's just asked a question, which also kind of ties into one that I've received in the background. So Amanda's questions are the credits going to generate enough revenue to cover the costs of baselining, monitoring, and validation? And sort of the other question that I had here was whether you could share a bit more about the existing voluntary market for biodiversity in terms of how credits are currently valued. So I guess two separate questions, but they're both kind of linked to the pricing around biodiversity credits.
Yeah, so of course the credits will be priced at what would cover the work and also facilitate restoration. So the initial surveys, outside of the work that we did within this project, but just the wider research on biodiversity crediting, is that given the greenwashing accusations that shook the carbon market probably 2 years ago at this point, most buyers of biodiversity credits will prefer higher integrity, higher priced credits. And there isn't a set standard for the credits yet in terms of price, because even the definition of a credit is still not fully, there's not full consensus on that across the market. So the credits will have to be priced to cover the work, obviously. But buyers generally are looking more towards higher integrity and higher priced biodiversity credits as the market currently stands. Like, there would be no point in creating a system where you would price the credits for lower than what you would get paid back for. The nice thing about the explicit bundled credits is that their value is independent of the exact percent of the uplift associated with the credit. So you could set the price of the explicit bundle at what is necessary for funding the restoration work as well as the monitoring. can you remind me of the second question that was more about credit structures in that? I think I only answered Amanda's question with that.
No, that's okay. The second one was more just about some information about the existing market. So do you have any kind of estimates about how biodiversity credits are currently valued?
Like I said, it's honestly standard specific at this point because it's such a young, volatile market. There's some credits that are as cheap as $5 a credit and some that are upwards of $30 to $50 a credit. But again, those aren't even using the same standard or the same explicit definition of biodiversity. So it's the Wild West out here. We're hoping that following COP16, there's going to be better guidance. Even over the last year, there's been country-specific guidance. Several different NGOs have created their own guidance for what it means to have a quality credit, a definition of a credit, and different market standards. That market scaffolding that needs to occur for the prices and the definitions of credits to get better standardized is in development on a global level. But really, this is quite a young market. All of this stuff isn't figured out yet. So, I mean, I could say $5 to $30 to give you some range, but I would say even that, I don't know the exact price of every different credit that's being sold under the, almost 100 different methodologies and standards that are out there already. And a lot of these are likely to drop off as more consistent guidance comes out because some of them they just have really different scopes. I think in Australia, they have so many different types of biodiversity credits. I'm not as familiar with that market, but they'll have carbon credits on top of habitat credits, on top of biodiversity credits, on top of I think they even have koala credits, like very species-specific credits. Yeah, so it's a really tough question to answer because of just how much is going on.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I think that's, unless anybody has any final questions in the chat, I'll hand that back to Susan.
Great, thanks, Nat, and thank you all for your excellent questions. So I think that's taking us towards the end of the presentation. So yes, just to thank all of our presenters today, Mark, John, Joe, Lorna, and Nat as well, for such insightful presentations on such a complex and fascinating topic. Before we finish up, I'm just going to launch a quick feedback poll. So if you could all just take a little second to complete that, please, that'll be really helpful in planning future webinars. And yes, as I mentioned before, this session has been recorded, so we will be uploading that to our website and sharing that through our various communication channels. So please do look out for that if you'd like to watch it back in future. But yeah, all that's left to do is to thank you all once again for attending, thank our speakers, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next webinar soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.